12, August 1943, Camp Hearne, Texas. The train shuddered to a halt just after noon, and Unteroffizier Karl Weber pressed his palm against the warm glass to steady himself as the line of Pullman cars sighed out a final breath of steam into the Texas heat. He stepped down with his kit, blinked against the sun, and tried to square what he saw with what he had been told for years. The platform was busy, not chaotic. American guards spoke to one another in brief phrases and pointed with open hands, not with rifles. Beyond the fence, he noticed electric lines strung in regular intervals and lamps bolted to poles that would turn night into day. He had slept the previous evening in a padded seat that folded into a berth, and at breakfast he had eaten eggs and bread that tasted like a holiday. Now he stood on a parade ground that had been wheat stubble a few months earlier, but was now raked flat, gridded by gravel paths, and ringed by barracks with straight eaves and chimneys that hinted at hot water and steam heat. A corporal in a crisp shirt checked his identity and told him in clear German to follow the man with the clipboard. Karl did not argue. He had been a machinist at a Siemens plant in Berlin before the call-up, the kind of worker who knew the temper of steel by the sound of a file and who could coil copper tube without kinking it. He had survived the long retreat from Libya to Tunisia, and he had raised his hands west of Matur on 12th of May when the order to surrender rippled through the remnants of his unit. He had expected hunger, darkness, and punishment. Instead, he was handed a numbered tag, told his rights under the Geneva Convention, and led past a bathhouse whose tiled floor shone. He noted the valves and the gauges the way another man might note the sky. He was 27, thin from months in the desert, careful by habit, proud of his craft, and now utterly unsure of what would be asked of him. As he was marched between two rows of barracks, he felt the unnatural comfort of the shade and smelled boiled laundry. The smell hooked his attention even more than the electric lines did. Laundry meant hot water, and hot water meant boilers and pipes and a workload that was never done in a camp that already held thousands and would soon hold more. What happened to Karl that day sat inside a wider current that historians have measured in ship counts, rail schedules, and maps dotted with tiny flags. In May 1943, the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa put between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers into Allied hands. American and British commands decided that a large share would travel across the Atlantic rather than be held close to the battlefields. Liberty ships that had carried cargo to Oran and Bizerte loaded human cargo for the return legs. By the summer, the United States was moving tens of thousands of prisoners every month, often 2 weeks at sea followed by 2 or 3 days by rail. A single class of standard cargo vessel, the Hearne, Liberty type, reached a wartime total of 2,710 hulls, a figure that astonished German technical officers when they learned it. The movement of prisoners was part of a larger river of things in motion. In 1943, the United States built more than 85,000 aircraft, launched about 1,700 merchant ships of various kinds, and consumed so much electric power that a single plant like Ford's Willow Run could draw more current than entire European cities. Camps rose to meet the influx. By late 1943, there were more than 170 principal prisoner camps and hundreds of branch camps in 45 states. Texas alone would hold more than 70,000 Axis prisoners by 1945, spread across major sites like Camp Hearne, Camp Swift, and Camp Huntsville, with smaller compounds attached to farms and canneries. The rules for treatment were not kindness in the naive sense, but policy. The War Department calculated the value of steady labor and made hygiene and order part of that calculation. Hot water and clean clothes kept disease down and kept work crews ready. That logic built bathhouses and laundries and kitchens with mixers as big as car engines. It also created bottlenecks. Every machine that washed sheets and uniforms at Hearne needed hot water at the start of the day, and every barracks wanted hot water at the same hour for shaving and cleaning. The pressure in the lines dropped, the temperatures fell, and the laundry crews cursed the peak draw. Men like Karl, who could read pipes like other men read faces, felt the shape of the problem before they could name it. He would learn the numbers soon enough. Camp Hearne had been built in about 4 months to house several thousand men. The engineers laid out streets, dug trenches for sewer lines, erected more than 200 buildings, and wired barracks with lights. They did not have time to design a system that could absorb every morning surge. In the records that survive, inspectors note complaints about tepid water and uneven pressure during peak hours. The men in the lines of sinks grumbled and joked, but the laundry crews in the heat swore that shirts came out less clean when the water cooled. On Karl's first full morning in camp, he waited with a tin cup for coffee and listened to a fellow prisoner tell how he had watched American yard workers refill a locomotive tender in minutes with an electric pump and a coal tower. Karl filed the detail away. Pumps made a difference. Storage made a difference. A system that could bank heat and deliver it when needed was better than one that simply boiled and bled. Karl settled into a barracks where the winter coat of dust drifted even in August. At night, he lay on a bunk and traced a diagram in his head, the way he had done back in Berlin when a supervisor asked him to fit a new heat exchanger into a cramped housing. He had never designed a boiler, but heat was heat and water was water, and the rules were the same everywhere. The camp ran on schedules: reveille before sunrise, roll call, breakfast. Work details marched out to fields and mills and canneries, noon meal, afternoon work, then back through the gates before evening. The laundry ran nearly all day, except when the water lost its bite and the foreman waved his arms in frustration. At the canteen, Karl spent his first coupons on a cheap pencil and a small notebook. He stood by the fence and sketched a coil wrapped around a small barrel. He needed a vessel that could stand heat, a coil of pipe to make a heat exchanger, a smoke path that could be fed with wood or scrap, and a way to raise and lower the stack to control draw. He did not have a machine shop, but he had eyes, a quiet step, and a habit of looking behind things. The first piece came from a farm detail. Prisoners rode in the back of a truck to pick vegetables and load crates. In a shed, he saw a dented oil drum leaning against a post, its interior scraped clean. He asked the farmer in slow English if he could trade labor for the drum. The farmer laughed and said, "Take the old thing." On the ride back, the guard saw the barrel and asked what he planned to do with it. Karl, who had learned caution in a city where the wrong sentence could end a life, kept it simple. He said he had a mind to make a water heater for washing. The guard shrugged. Back in camp, rules required that any new project be cleared by a work supervisor. Karl brought the drum to the laundry yard anyway and set it by the wall behind a stack of wooden crates. For coil, he needed copper or at least decent steel tubing. He found pieces of damaged pipe stacked near a maintenance shed, short lengths removed from a repair. He asked, in careful German tinted with camp English, if the broken pieces were scrap. The maintenance man waved him off with a motion that meant yes. Karl knew how to bend tube with sand as a filler to prevent kinks. He scrounged a funnel, filled the pipe with dry sand, plugged the ends with rags, and bent a spiral around the oil drum. He worked after supper, when the yard quieted and the air cooled. The first evening, he had a dry coil and a dirty shirt. On the second, he worked on a firebox from salvaged brick and broken concrete. On the third, he set the drum on the low wall and fed the coil through a hole he cut with a hacksaw blade that he borrowed and returned. He ran the coil inlet to a spigot that had weak flow in the evenings, and the outlet to a galvanized tub that sat just inside the laundry doorway. The whole contraption was invisible from the main yard unless one walked around the crates. He lit a small fire, watched the flame lick the drum, and counted heartbeats. He had no thermometer, but he had his hand and a patient mind. The water in the tub warmed. He added a little more fuel and watched the coil sweat and hiss. The trick would be steady flow. He needed a gravity feed and a safe outlet. By the end of the week, he had added a second drum, this one filled with water and wrapped in canvas to reduce heat loss, stacked on a pallet above the first. At dawn on Sunday, when the laundry did not run at full tilt, he demonstrated the thing to two men who ran the wash kettles. They had experience with heat that came and went, and their eyes widened when the tub stayed hot as shirts moved through the suds. One of them slapped his shoulder and said this would make his day shorter by an hour. The other told him to keep it out of sight for now. The Americans were not cruel, but they were particular, and an unauthorized heater could get them all a lecture or worse. Karl agreed. He had built something that worked, but he had also built something that broke a small rule in the service of a larger order. He slept better that night than he had since Tunisia. The small heater would matter because of what surrounded it, and the documentary record gives that surrounding shape. Hearne's daily routine required hot water for thousands of men. Each barracks had electric light. Each building had sinks, but the main volume of hot water moved through the laundry and the bathhouses. In reports filed by camp officers, work crews washed tons of clothing every week and ran shower shifts that moved men through in timed waves. In the summer of 1943, the broader war bent toward the factories. In August, the Allied bombing campaign against Germany shifted to emphasize oil and aircraft production. At the same time, the American mainland ran at a peak that brought night shifts to towns that had never seen them before. A single steel mill in Ohio poured thousands of tons of product in a day. Synthetic rubber plants near Louisville produced hundreds of thousands of tons per year to replace cut-off natural supply. A bomber plant near Ypsilanti finished a B-24 every hour or so at peak with help from more than 1.5 million parts delivered by a web of subcontractors. All that noise and motion echoed in small ways inside the wire at Hearne. The camp laundry used American detergents in sacks heavier than a man could carry, soaps that foamed whether the water was hard or soft. The boilers pushed to satisfy the morning rush, the gauges fell, and the crews waited for heat to climb again. In that pause, shirts did not come clean, and men grumbled, and the schedule slipped. 1 extra hour of effective hot water per day shaved effort across a week. It reduced skin infections that camp doctors noted when wash days went wrong, and men reused damp shirts. It kept men in a better humor on the line. Those are small things until they are counted by the thousands. In letters that passed the censor, prisoners mentioned the routines that governed their days. Some wrote of the food. Some wrote of the electric light. In a later camp newspaper edited by anti-Nazi prisoners, a contributor wrote that what surprised him most was the regularity of things. Hot coffee in the morning, clean sheets, a library visit if he wanted to read. A line like that tells a historian that small changes in those routines were felt by many. It is in that context that a hidden heater, wrapped in the anonymity of scrap and tucked behind crates, becomes part of the story. Karl never claimed to be a hero. He built things because he knew how, and because doing so balanced his mind. After a week of careful use, word of the warmer tubs traveled across the yard in a way that made its secrecy pointless. A sergeant who kept the maintenance ledger walked around the crates one morning, folded his arms, and watched as steam rose in a steady curl. He did not shout. He asked who had done it. Karl raised his hand. The sergeant asked if the drum was clean and if the joints were tight. He turned the valves himself, checked for leaks, and then did a thing that revealed the American mind that the prisoners were still learning to understand. He told Karl to move the coil away from the wooden wall, to stand the drum on bricks instead of a pallet, and to add a sheet of tin as a heat shield. Then he told him to keep it running and walked away. In a camp that was an island inside a nation that measured production in millions of units, an improvised heat exchanger earned a place not because it broke a rule, but because it made the system work a little better. On the night of 21st of August, Karl wrote in his small notebook that the water had stayed hot through the worst of the rush, that shirts came clean, and that the washer crew sang while they worked. He closed the book, turned out his light, and listened to the hum that he now understood. It was not the hum of war news or ideology, but the simple sound of pumps and wires and human motion that kept the place on time. Karl woke before dawn on 22nd of August 1943 and lay quiet on the bunk until the first bell. He dressed and crossed the yard with a purpose that felt almost like his old factory mornings in Berlin. The air was already warm, and a faint line of smoke drifted from behind the crates where his barrel and coil waited. He checked the joints with a bare hand, turned the inlet a quarter turn, and watched the first thread of water begin to move. A minute later, the outlet at the galvanized tub gave a steady ribbon that steamed in the dim light. The two washmen shuffled in with baskets balanced on hips, grinned at the rising heat, and began their rhythm without delay. Karl kept his eyes on the coil while the fire caught, and then sat back on his heels, hands folded, counting the time between a small stick of wood and a visible change in the sheen on the drum. He could read heat by habit. The maintenance sergeant returned with a younger private who carried a dented bucket of brick fragments. They raised the drum onto a bed of brick as ordered, slid a square of roofing tin between the coil and the slat wall, and checked the run of the outlet to be sure it had a clean fall into the tub. The sergeant said a single word that was praise without flourish. Good. Then he told Karl to meet him at noon at the shop. At midday, Karl stepped into the maintenance shed and saw order that comforted him. Racks of salvaged pipe marked by diameter, boxes of fittings sorted by thread, a battered vise bolted to a bench that bore the scars of 100 repairs. The sergeant pointed to a milk crate with odd items that were not on any inventory. There was a small pressure gauge with a cracked lens, a length of soft copper tube from a broken icebox, and a brass swing check that had once been part of a farm pump. He said he could not officially issue these things for a prisoner project, but they could be used if they were returned. He did not smile. He did not need to. Karl spent the rest of the noon hour fitting the gauge to a T where he could see it from the laundry door, and soldering the check valve into the outlet, so hot water would not bleed back when flow slowed. When the afternoon shift began, water that had fallen away by habit now held steady through a full run of shirts, and the washmen began to plan their loading by the new certainty in the tub. When the sun set, Karl washed his hands in water that was still warm and closed his notebook on a page that said only this. Pressure held at 2 1/2. Outlet heat steady. Fire even. The words were small, but in his mind they were the beginning of something larger than a hidden coil behind crates. He had found a way to store heat when the main line faltered. He had learned to feed the coil without starve or surge. He had built a small reserve that turned a crowded hour into a manageable one. In a camp where the bell set the pace and thousands of hands moved by that bell, a single hour with heat could change the way a day felt, the way tempers held, the way skin healed after hard work in fields and canneries. What happened in that corner of the laundry yard can be read against the wide canvas of the summer and autumn of 1943. American records from the Provost Marshal General list growing numbers of prisoners assigned to civilian labor under the Geneva Convention, a practice that expanded in August and September as the harvest season pressed across the Midwest and the South. In Texas alone, camp rosters show thousands of men sent out daily to pick cotton, cut cane, load tomatoes, and stack hay. Reports count days of labor in the millions by the end of the year. The same ledgers that count labor also list sickness, injuries, and lost time. Skin infections, heat rash, and minor wounds rise when water is scarce or cold. They fall when laundry keeps pace and showers run on schedule. Physicians attached to camps filed weekly tallies. When hot water holds through the morning, dermatitis tallies drop, and so do absences from details. Camp Hearne itself sat inside a state where electric power had grown quickly in the years before the war. Rural lines multiplied after federal programs brought credit to cooperatives. In 1940, a minority of farms in the state had full electric service. By 1943, the share had risen to a large majority in many counties, and in the belt east of the Brazos River, the sight of a light bulb in a barn was no longer a marvel. The same expansion of power that brightened farmyards underwrote the pumps and heaters of a camp, built in 4 months to hold thousands. Yet even a camp wired to the masthead of the American grid felt strain at the edges. A single boiler could push heat into the mains at full dawn and still lose ground when 2,000 men turned taps within the same 20-minute window. The engineering answer in a factory would have been a larger plant, a better distribution loop, or a stratified storage tank that held several thousand gallons at a steady temperature. A prisoner compound did not receive that level of capital because the war had claims on every ton of steel and every boiler shell. It did, however, receive men with skill and time and an appetite to solve what lay in front of them. Contemporary American inspection notes from late August mention a local improvement in laundry performance at Hearne and credit sustained hot water during peak hours. The line reads like a clipped aside, but the timing matches the week that Carl and the maintenance sergeant made the coil safer and added the check valve. The note does not name a prisoner. It simply says that peak lag has eased and output met schedule for 4 days straight. While this camp wrestled with tubs and kettles, the wider war counted in larger numbers. In August, the Allied campaign on Sicily ended with the island secured. In September, Italy signed an armistice. In October, American shipyards passed the 600 figure for Liberty ships delivered in that calendar year. In November, the combined bomber offensive sent thousands of sorties against factories in the Ruhr and against ball-bearing production in Schweinfurt. The scale was vast, but experience at the small scale often set the tone by which men lived the vastness. A camp that ran on time and stayed clean was a camp where discipline held without cruelty, and where the day could be spent in work rather than in waiting. In letters that reached home months later, former prisoners remembered the shock of abundance and also the smaller comforts that made each day bearable. Electric light that did not flicker, a library with worn covers, hot water at a sink when the morning bell rang. It is in those details that the story of a small invention sits with weight. Within a fortnight, the hidden heater had become something else. It was no longer a secret. It was a pilot. The maintenance sergeant brought Karl into the shop after evening roll and laid out a 3-step plan in plain words. First, make the existing set safe with better anchors and a proper flue, since sparks near crates were a danger that no one would forgive. Second, add a second coil on a twin drum to feed the rinse tubs, because the rinse ran cool when the wash stole all the heat. Third, write out an explanation in simple terms so that a crew could keep the system running without the builder at hand. Karl nodded and began to list parts. He needed more brick and a short length of stovepipe, a wire mesh spark screen, and 2 lengths of copper tube for thermosiphon links between the storage drum and the coil barrel. He asked for a small float valve to regulate the level in the upper reservoir. The sergeant found a float in a box that had come from a demolished ice plant and told Karl to make it work with what he had. The next evenings were patient work. Karl fixed a proper base of brick that raised both barrels off the ground, set a sheet of tin beneath them, and linked the second coil in parallel so that the flow to wash and rinse would hold steady when the main line fell. He used the cracked lens gauge anyway, and learned to read the needle by feel even when the numbers were blurred. He ran the new flue to a stack that rose above the roofline and added the spark screen. He anchored everything with wire through drilled holes so that nothing shifted when someone leaned hard against a drum. Then he tested. He watched the needle rise and stabilize, cut the fuel, and timed the fall. He wrote a single page of instructions in clean hand. He wrote that fuel must be kept small and steady. He wrote that the float must sit level. He wrote that the outlet must never be throttled to 0, since steam would climb and cause a burn. He gave the sheet to the washman and then to the sergeant. He asked for a translation into the simplest English so that a guard on duty could understand the safety rules. The sergeant agreed. On Monday of the new week, the laundry ran the entire morning without a slip. Shirts came clean. Rinse water did not turn cold. The wash crews finished early and moved to their next task with better humor. The bathhouse chief came to look and immediately asked if a similar unit could be fitted near the showers as a peak hour assist. Karl looked at the piping and said it could, if a coil could be fitted to a storage tank already on site. He would not cut anything without permission. The sergeant agreed to ask. That afternoon, a small group of officers visited the laundry yard and stood in a half-circle around the brick base. They had the stance of men who would rather be somewhere else, but who understood that this was the place where the day could be saved. One asked about safety. One asked about fuel use. One asked how many hours the coil would run before cleaning was needed. Karl answered in short phrases. He said the coil held steady if soot was brushed off every 3rd day. He said fuel use was small, since the coil harvested heat that would otherwise drift past the drum. He said the men already saved time and soap when water stayed hot. The senior officer nodded and said, "Keep it." He turned to the sergeant and said to note the project in the log. That night, Karl slept deeply. In the dark, the memory of Mature rose up again and faded. He had no illusions about the men in the towers and the wire that ringed the camp. He knew he was a prisoner of a nation at war with his own. But he also knew that the work of hands could make a day better without permission from any flag or anthem. In the morning when the bell woke the camp, steam already drifted above the laundry roof. The documentary record beyond the fence supports the sense of what that day felt like. In late 1943, American agriculture faced a shortage of seasonal hands. War plants kept men and women in towns that had been quiet before. prisoners became part of the answer. Reports filed by county agents in Texas and Oklahoma speak of hundreds of prisoners delivered to fields under guard, of cotton bolls picked by the ton, of sugar beets lifted and loaded, of tomatoes crated by the tens of thousands. At the same time, state health departments and Army medical officers shared data on outbreaks that could cripple work. Lice, scabies, and impetigo rose where washing lagged. They fell where washing kept pace and where hot water reached into cuffs and seams. A prisoner camp that learned to extend its hot water by an hour each morning and by another hour each evening for showers was not just more comfortable. It was more productive and safer by the yardstick that wartime officials used. Camp Hearne appears in those ledgers as orderly and well-run by the last quarter of the year. Complaints about tepid water during peaks diminish in the inspection notes. The camp newspaper, produced by anti-Nazi editors, ran a small item praising the laundry crews for keeping up with the flood of uniforms returning from field details. It did not print the name of a builder. It did not need to. In the same months, the national numbers reached new heights. The United States produced more than 5 million tons of finished steel in some months of that year. Electric utilities reported record demand. Railroads moved hundreds of millions of ton-miles each month and did so with timetables that astonished European observers. Norfolk and New York and New Orleans counted ship movements in dozens per day. Kansas and Nebraska moved harvests that filled grain elevators to their tops. In that sea of figures, it can seem odd to pause at a photograph in a camp file that shows a dented drum on a brick stand, a wire mesh spark screen, and a short man with his hands behind his back looking at a small gauge. Yet that photograph, taken by a visiting officer who had the habit of recording small improvements, says something that the large numbers cannot. The power of a system rests on many small reserves that smooth the hours when load surges. A city builds tanks on hills for that purpose. A railroad builds sidings for that purpose. A camp laundry builds a simple coil and a storage drum for that purpose because a prisoner with a machinist mind and a cooperative sergeant see what is needed. In later testimony given by former prisoners about their time in Texas, several men remembered warm water in the morning with a note of wonder. One wrote that he could shave without tearing his face and that this small grace made him feel human. Another wrote that he stopped dreading laundry duty because the tubs did not go cold when the line was longest. These are not grand lines, but they are part of the record. They show how a hidden invention became accepted, and how acceptance turned a corner of a hard place into a workshop where the useful became official. On the evening of 5th of September, Karl sat by the wall when the washman waved him over to share coffee from a tin cup that had dark stains at the lip. He drank, nodded his thanks, and wrote one more quiet sentence in his book. The coil works. Men smile. The day holds. He closed the cover and tucked the book under his head as a pillow. He did not know yet that the bathhouse chief would come with permission for a second unit, or that the sergeant would ask him to teach 3 others to tend the fire and the float. He knew only that the gauge held at 2 1/2, and that the steam curled steady in the evening light. By mid-September 1943, Karl's work had spread beyond the laundry yard. The bathhouse chief, a former civil engineer from Hamburg named Meyer, received permission to test a second coil system near the shower block. He approached Karl with blueprints traced on coarse brown wrapping paper, showing the existing hot water tank that fed 20 shower heads. The design was simple but overworked. Every evening when men returned from field labor, the temperature fell to lukewarm within minutes. Karl inspected the pipes, tapped a line with a wrench, and nodded. The tank stood high enough that a thermosiphon loop could feed it without extra pumps. He requested one more oil drum, more copper pipe, and a few days to assemble. The sergeant approved the scavenging run, and by the following week, a new coil gleamed beside the bathhouse wall. It borrowed the same logic as the laundry heater: small fire, slow circulation, constant pressure. And by the first night's test, the showers stayed hot through both prisoner shifts. Men who had grown used to shivering queues stepped out grinning, steam rolling into the dusk. The bathhouse orderlies clapped Karl on the shoulder. One muttered that he should have been an engineer, not a corporal. The next morning, the camp commander himself arrived to inspect. He was polite but formal, tall under the brim of his hat, and asked few questions. He saw the coil, the gauge, the safety vent, and the tidy bricks. He approved the continuation with a note to extend model as resources allow. That phrase entered the camp's administrative log, and by its plainness, became official sanction. Karl's hidden heater was now a recognized improvement, filed under utilities. Outside the wire, the war and the nation around it continued to expand in scale that made such small inventions seem invisible yet strangely linked. By September, Liberty ships were being launched at an average of 3 per day. Each ship carried parts forged in 30 or more states, a moving map of assembly and logistics that dwarfed any European effort. American steel output exceeded 6.5 million tons for the month. The country's electric grid, newly coordinated through wartime agencies, delivered 160 billion kilowatt-hours that year, feeding the same kind of resistance coils, motors, and pumps that Karl mimicked in miniature. Inside the United States, more than 370,000 Axis prisoners were already distributed across more than 500 camps. Nearly 1/3 worked daily in agriculture. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office estimated their combined labor value at more than $200 million per year. Each camp, regardless of size, consumed water, fuel, and electricity equivalent to a small town. Camp Hearne's records show deliveries of hundreds of cords of firewood monthly for heating, plus coal for the main boiler. Any efficiency, any saved ton, mattered. The local superintendent of utilities, in correspondence with military engineers, even remarked that the camp's self-heating laundry unit had reduced draw on the main boiler by measurable degrees during morning peaks. That line, buried in an appendix, indirectly recorded Karl's success. When wartime planners studied fuel usage, they saw charts dip slightly and called it conservation. They never knew it began with one man bending pipe by hand behind a laundry wall. Within the camp, the heater's fame bred imitation. Prisoners assigned to carpentry and mechanics began to experiment. A Polish worker in a mixed compound built a small oven using Karl's coil principle to heat dishwater for the kitchen. Another group repurposed empty tin cans to make tiny draft chimneys that carried smoke higher, improving combustion. The Americans watched these efforts closely. Some officers worried about fire risk. Others saw education at work. The War Department had already begun its secret Special Projects Division, an effort to re-educate German prisoners through exposure to democratic ideas and technical knowledge. At Hearne, where discipline was good and morale steady, officials decided to channel curiosity rather than suppress it. Karl found himself asked to supervise small technical improvement sessions twice a week. He stood before a chalkboard salvaged from the camp schoolhouse and drew simple diagrams: water flow, temperature gradients, expansion volume. He taught the words in both languages so guards could follow: valve, pressure, safety, vent. The sessions grew. By October, 30 men attended. They built small demonstration coils under supervision, strictly for utility blocks, each one tested by American maintenance before use. For Karl, the work filled the empty hours. He wrote in his notebook that teaching steadied his hands and reminded him of the apprentices he had once guided in Berlin. They listen without fear, he noted, and the Americans listen also. Perhaps this is how rebuilding begins, by learning side by side. That line, later copied by POW, another prisoner, into a camp paper, survived long after the war. It captured the quiet shift from enforced order to cooperative enterprise inside the fences. The historian reading these fragments sees in them a reflection of the broader transformation taking place across all camps in America. By late 1943, re-education had moved from experiment to policy. Over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in structured classes: English, mathematics, mechanics, civics. Universities supplied correspondence courses. Professors lectured in person. The goal was subtle: to replace militarized obedience with disciplined craftsmanship and critical thought. Camp Hearne, with its steady record and skilled population, became a pilot center for what official memos called constructive occupation. Hot water coils and brick fireboxes were small things, but they embodied that philosophy. They turned prisoners from idle men into problem solvers working under supervision for mutual benefit. Reports note a marked drop in disciplinary incidents and illness. By winter, the camp's own newsletter published a short article, unsigned but written in the calm tone of experience, explaining how resourcefulness serves both cleanliness and morale. The author described the new water heating units as proof that technical skill transcends uniform. When those lines were read aloud in the evening study circle, guards did not interrupt. They knew that a machine which kept order and health was as valuable as any sermon on democracy. That winter, when the north wind cut across the Texas plains and frost silvered the wire, the showers at Camp Hearne stayed warm. Karl's coil, once hidden behind crates, had been duplicated a dozen times and inspected by visiting officers from other camps. Its principle, store heat, release it when demand surges, was filed into an engineering memorandum and distributed to similar facilities. Years later, long after the wire came down, fragments of those memos would appear in archives under headings like Field Expedient Heat Recovery Units. None named Karl Weber, but all bore the trace of his hands and of a morning in August when he bent a length of pipe and proved that knowledge, even in captivity, can flow like water through copper. By late October 1943, the rhythm of camp life had settled into something that resembled routine, and within that routine, Karl found a purpose few prisoners could claim. Every morning began before sunrise, when the air hung cool and still, and a haze of smoke drifted above the camp from the various heating units. He walked his circuit, laundry first, then the bathhouse, to check the gauges and listen for the soft hiss that meant water was circulating properly. He carried a small wrench and an oiled rag folded in his pocket, the tools of quiet authority. The guards recognized him by now and let him pass without comment. In the laundry yard, men already stood at the tubs, steam curling around their faces as they worked. The once hidden heater had become part of the landscape, as ordinary as the flagpole or the mess hall. Yet Karl never stopped adjusting, cleaning, or refining. He noticed soot gathering too quickly in the flue, so he added a removable ash gate. When a float valve stuck one cold morning, he took it apart and polished the brass with sand until it moved smooth again. He kept records on each repair in his notebook, a growing ledger of pressure readings, flow rates, and water temperatures. Each number carried a memory. the day the showers held through evening, the first time an American officer shook his hand, the moment when the laundry crews began to trust that the water would not run cold halfway through. Those records would outlast him, though he did not yet know it. Outside Camp Hearne, the scale of war pressed on. Across the Atlantic, Allied forces had landed at Salerno and pushed north through Italy's mountains. In the Pacific, island campaigns turned coral reefs into shipyards of wreckage. The United States home front reached a crescendo of production. Planes, tanks, shells, and ships rolling out in quantities measured by the minute. Within that immense machinery, the prisoner camps functioned like quiet auxiliaries. Reports from the War Department show over 90% of camps contributing organized labor by the end of 1943, filling shortages in agriculture and light industry. Hearne's men were sent to pick cotton, repair fences, or harvest vegetables in nearby counties, guarded but treated as necessary laborers. Each returning truck brought dust, sweat, and fatigue into the camp showers that Karl's coils kept warm. Army inspectors noted with satisfaction that hygiene levels remained consistently superior, and infection cases fell sharply. One physician wrote that consistent hot water had reduced clinic visits by half. For the Army, this was efficiency. For the prisoners, it was dignity. Clean skin meant less irritation, fewer sores, better sleep. Men began to take pride in their duties, an unintended consequence of engineering. What had started as an act of personal necessity was now woven into the camp's operation, a symbol of cooperation between captives and captors bound by the practical logic of running water. It was during one of those inspections that Karl's quiet work reached a new audience. In early November, a visiting group from the Corps of Engineers arrived to survey prisoner facilities across Texas. They walked through Hearne's main compound, noting layout, construction, and utilities. When they reached the laundry yard, one officer paused at the sight of Karl's brickwork and asked for details. The maintenance sergeant explained its purpose, tracing the copper coil with his finger as he spoke. The engineer nodded, examined the flue, and asked if it saved fuel. The sergeant replied that consumption had dropped noticeably since installation. The engineer scribbled notes and asked who designed it. When Karl stepped forward, the officer shook his hand, a brief, firm gesture that carried respect beyond words. The next week, a typed memorandum left Hearne for the regional office in Dallas describing an improvised heat recovery system devised by prisoner labor. Within a month, that report circulated through other districts. Several camps replicated the design using salvaged barrels, brick, and pipe. For every installation, the engineer's note credited the Hearne prototype. Karl's name was never written, but his work had entered official record. He continued to build, quietly overseeing the replication of units until 4 separate compounds in the camp had auxiliary heating. The Americans began referring to them simply as Weber units, though not all knew there was a man behind the name. The winter that followed tested everything. In December, a rare freeze swept through central Texas. Frost laced the barbed wire and turned the camp's open ground into a pale mirror of home for the Germans who missed the snow. Pipes that once flowed freely froze and cracked. The main boiler strained under the extra demand. Yet, through those cold nights, the Weber units held. The barrels, half buried in brick and fed by wood fires, tended carefully by crews Karl had trained, continued to circulate warm water through the most critical points. When temperatures dropped below freezing, the main bathhouse stayed open while others shut down across the state. Reports again recorded the fact with bureaucratic brevity. supplemental heating systems functioning effectively during extreme cold. What they did not record was the human side, the way prisoners gathered around the small fires at dawn to thaw their hands, the way the guards handed out extra coffee, the rare feeling of shared survival that crossed lines of uniform and language. Karl watched all of it from the edge of the yard, smoke rising from his coil, thinking how strange it was that his craft, once used to build parts for a war machine, now kept men warm in captivity. He had not set out to change anything. He had only wanted hot water for laundry. Yet from that simple impulse grew a quiet legacy of order amid chaos, a proof that knowledge, even stripped of nation and rank, still served life. January 1944 brought a new year and a slow thaw that left the fields around Camp Hearne damp and shining. For the first time in months, Karl felt the stir of something like calm. The war, though far away, still shaped every hour of his captivity, but within the wire the season had turned productive. The Weber units, as the guards called them, had proven durable. Only one had cracked under frost, and it was quickly rebuilt. With spring ahead, the camp's officers began to reorganize labor rotations for the planting season. German prisoners were to help Texas farmers sow cotton and sorghum, while others maintained the camp utilities. Karl was officially assigned as technical overseer for water systems, an unspoken recognition of his reliability. He spent his mornings checking gauges, his afternoons walking the perimeter with a notepad, recording leaks, and drafting repair requests for the maintenance crew. The Americans trusted him enough to leave him alone in the yard with tools, a privilege that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. His quiet authority had grown from usefulness, not rank. In one corner of his notebook, under a neat column of temperature readings, he wrote a short line that historians later found moving in its simplicity. "Work without fear is freedom enough." Outside, America's vast war economy was entering its most powerful phase. The combined chiefs of staff had finalized plans for an invasion of Western Europe, and by January, production numbers were staggering. Nearly 100,000 aircraft, built in the preceding year, over 8 million tons of steel in December alone, and grain yields that fed armies across 2 oceans. Each statistic carried unseen echoes in places like Hearne. The boilers and lights that served the camps drew from the same electric grid that powered the shipyards. The fuel that fed Karl's coils came from the same refineries that supplied the Army Air Forces. Even waste material from the camp, scrap metal, used grease, paper, was collected weekly by the War Production Board's salvage program. The line between the front and the home was economic rather than geographic. In that sense, Karl's invention was not a curiosity, but part of the larger efficiency that defined America's wartime system. The U.S. Army's Engineering Corps noted in a March 1944 report that field improvisations by alien labor had contributed to notable reductions in coal and wood consumption across southern camps. A quarter-page photograph of the Hearne coil accompanied the text, showing the barrel, the gauge, and the tidy rows of brick. To most readers, it was another example of American resourcefulness, but those who looked closely could see the German hand behind it. That spring, Karl's work took on an unexpected purpose. The Special Projects Division, Washington's secret education initiative for German prisoners, selected Hearne as one of its trial locations for vocational retraining. The Americans wanted to identify skilled tradesmen who could learn industrial practices compatible with post-war democracy. Karl, a machinist by training, and now something of an instructor by habit, was a natural fit. He was given permission to conduct structured classes under guard supervision. Twice a week, 50 prisoners gathered in a wooden hut that had once stored tools. Using chalk and salvaged parts, Karl demonstrated the principles of closed-loop heating, safe venting, and efficient fuel combustion. The guards observed silently, sometimes taking notes themselves. When the first class completed its project, a small brick-based stove for the kitchen washhouse, the supervising officer wrote that the German prisoners show marked aptitude for mechanical reasoning and cooperative work. It was the kind of remark that would later appear in congressional hearings about prisoner re-education. Yet for Karl, it was simply teaching. He told his students that precision and care were a man's best tools, no matter his uniform. He never spoke of ideology, but he practiced an ethic of method, patience, and shared knowledge that would have been impossible in the factories of wartime Germany.